so far so good.
Great. I was former Secret Service agent who came over to GA. He was an investigator. It's a crazy investigation. I was on Indian reservation, my friend.
Oh, I got some crazy stories from there.
So do I.
In fact, I was looking for a missing kid and had to go on the reservation. It wasn't not fun. Oh, this was back in 1997. Yeah, Martinez, a kid from Beaumont, California.
Did she get recovered?
He was recovered.
I think that's it.
Like seven. Yeah. It's a wild team back then. Deep bench. They know we're talking about. Hello. I know. Oh, thanks, sir. Thanks very much.
All right. Well, let's, we've got, I think, a quorum. We can go ahead and get started. I want to thank our participants for being here. This is not an official hearing, it's a roundtable discussion. The reason that we decided to start with this in a bipartisan manner is because we truly want to hear what is going on inside Homeland Security's INA, the good work that's being done. We know that there's probably things that we don't even know about, but we want to hear those things as we kind of look at whether or not the organization can be tailored, how it can best suit the needs of the users that are looking at that information, and you know, throughout the lens and perspective of our national security apparatus, how can we do things better? And I think this is a function of oversight that we should be doing, but we want to get the facts out there. And so, members, I will let you introduce yourselves when we get to the question part of this. I'll give you a couple minutes for any sort of opening statement, but I think it's best to just get into it. I'll hand it to my ranking member, Mr. Magaziner from Rhode Island, but then once we'll go through our participants, and I would ask you to keep your initial remarks to about 3 minutes. That way we can have a discussion. So instead of more of a hearing style, this is going to be a roundtable style. So about 3 minutes, and Mr. Crane here, Navy SEAL, will be the he'll be the timer on that. So any sort of filibusters, you know. Go ahead.
I'll be very brief. You know, I think we're all of an age that you know, September 11th was formative for us. You know, either as young adults or early in our careers, and so we understand vividly why INA was created. Right? We know that in the run-up to September 11th. There was intelligence being collected by local law enforcement, by the intelligence community, by others, and if those dots had just been connected, a travesty could have been prevented. But because no one was connecting the dots, because there were silos across law enforcement and across the intelligence community, that terrible day did occur. And so I think we recognize the importance of the INA concept and why it exists and why we need to have better communication and coordination across agencies. But we also recognize that, you know, through the years there have been some growing pains, right? And we can get more into that as we get into the discussion, but I think, you know, I want to center this on, I accept it as a given that coming out of 9/11, there's an important reason for INA to exist, an important function that it has. But we got to kind of continue to seek improvement work through the kinks and make this this agency function as well as it possibly can to help keep the American people safe. So that's how I approach this, and I just thank you all for participating and thank Chairman Pfluger for convening us.
Very good. Ms. McNeil, we'll start with you. Maybe briefly introduce yourself, but then about 3 minutes or so to discuss your thoughts, and then we'll just go in a counterclockwise manner to Mr. Cohen and so forth.
Great. Triana McNeil, Director with GAO's Homeland Security and Justice team. My portfolio includes issues related to domestic terrorism, violent extremism, as well as drug misuse with a law enforcement focus. So the agencies I tend to audit are DHS, INA, FBI, as well as DEA and ONDCP. So I'll just jump into my prepared statement. I promise you it's less than 3 minutes. DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis is responsible for gathering and disseminating intelligence to its federal partners and state and local governments. We have conducted numerous reviews of DHS INA over the past few years. The one review focused solely on INA covered how it prioritizes threats, how it monitors if personnel are following privacy-related policies, and how it knows if it's being effective. We found it uses a threat banding approach with input from the field to set priorities. We also made recommendations related to deficiencies we identified over how it protects information related to U.S. persons. And we found that INA cannot provide the necessary information to illustrate if it is meeting many of its strategic goals, for example, goals related to counterterrorism or combating transnational organized crime. Since we issued this report in August of 2023, INA has made some progress. INA addressed one of our recommendations by finalizing a standard operating procedure for conducting some of its oversight of its personnel compliance with laws pertaining to collecting, retaining, and disseminating information on U.S. persons. The other reports that we issued focused on INA's role to process and share threat-related information, its role in countering domestic terrorism, and how it shares threat-related information with internet companies. Our recommendations from these reports center around, for example, addressing internal control deficiencies related to processing threat information and evaluating ways that they collaborate with the FBI, especially in the field, as well as developing goals and strategies for their information sharing mechanisms with social media and gaming companies to counter threats posed by domestic violent extremists on their platforms. INA has made some progress, but much more is needed. For example, with the upcoming election, it is imperative that they understand how best to work with the FBI and fully process all the tips and information they gather to ensure they can provide actionable threat information to their federal partners and state and local governments. They also need to know if their efforts are effective. Threats by violent extremists and transnational criminal organizations are high, and they do not collect performance information related to those strategic goals. They don't know if they are meeting them. GAO will continue to follow up on all of these recommendations, of which there are 16, and we will continue to work with INA as they make progress on these efforts.
Very good. Thank you very much. Mr. Cohen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman, Magaziner, members. My name is John Cohen. For those of you who don't know me, I led INA twice during the Obama and Biden administrations. I served as acting undersecretary as well as counterterrorism coordinator at the Department of Homeland Security. I've had about 40 years law enforcement, homeland security, national security experience. Worked as a police officer, investigator, homeland security advisor to multiple states. I first began to work with INA when I was the homeland security advisor to Mitt Romney in Massachusetts when he was governor there. I continued to work with INA during the Bush administration when I served in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, focusing on information sharing issues, where I worked with Mike Senna and others to develop the first national strategy for information sharing. As I mentioned, I been fortunate to work with the men and women of INA, and I've seen firsthand, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the talent, the commitment, the dedication to service that exists within that organization. As you all know, INA derives its authorities from two primary sources. Its authorities that come under law from the Homeland Security Act, which has been amended several times, and through Executive Order 12333, which, as a member of the intelligence community, integrates INA's activities with others in the intelligence community. And I think that while the intention, when Congress created INA, and as it amended that creation over time, the intention was to build a bridge between the intelligence community, other members of the federal government, and within DHS with the operational components, state, local, tribal governments, the private sector, so that in an organized, integrated way, we could gather information, integrate it, develop unique analytic judgments, and share those judgments with those responsible for protecting this nation. And I think over time, INA has had difficulty integrating both its intelligence community role with its role that comes under the Homeland Security Act. And I look forward to having discussions today about that, because we are, quite frankly, in a threat period, which I have said publicly is probably the most volatile, complex dynamic that I've experienced in my 40 years of law enforcement. We're dealing with threat activity that integrates what occurs in the digital world with that occurs in the physical world. And it is my belief that not just DHS, but the federal government has been slow to adapt its investigative and threat mitigation activities based on the evolving threat. So thank you for convening this roundtable. I hope it's the beginning of a longer conversation. I look forward to participating with my colleagues.
Thank you very much. Mr. Rooms.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, thanks for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. My name is Spencer Reynolds. I am Senior Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice, where I advocate for effective national security solutions that promote constitutional rights and liberties. Previously, I was an attorney at the Department of Homeland Security, where I advised on domestic intelligence and counterterrorism operations, including those of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. Attorney-client privilege prohibits me from getting into the details of my work at DHS, but I'm happy to share insights about the challenges that INA faces. INA is a long-troubled element of the U.S. intelligence community, best characterized by broad mandates and weak safeguards for constitutional rights. INA targeted demonstrators and journalists during 2020 racial justice protests and created dossiers on Americans. It declared vandalism of non-federal monuments a homeland security threat, while then declining to warn about the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. And today it is targeting activists opposing a police training facility in Georgia, speculating about a nationwide terrorism spree. INA manages to get into this trouble even though the agency is limited to only two methods of collection: overtly, typically from face-to-face conversations, or it can collect publicly available information, which drives its social media monitoring operations. It has at times struggled with both. Politico revealed last year that INA was collecting information from people in jails without involving their attorneys, undermining constitutional rights. In the most recent NDAA, Congress took good initial steps to rein in this practice. But other concerning practices remain, particularly with how INA handles social media collection. The agency takes an expansive view of terrorism. It then monitors Americans talking politics on social media on the theory that it helps anticipate the next terrorist attack. For example, around the overturning of Roe v. Wade, INA targeted Americans' quote, reactions and reflections about abortion rights. It's called concerns about environmental harms and so-called anti-law enforcement sentiment, domestic violent extremist narratives, and suggested violent extremists would exploit views about the COVID-19 pandemic. DHS itself ascribes dangerousness to what it calls conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, neither INA nor DHS has ever articulated how they infer violence from political speech, and in doing this collection, draw sweeping conclusions from American social media. When it comes to oversight, transparency, and accountability, there's opportunity for improvement. First, the office responsible for conducting intelligence oversight of INA reports to INA's undersecretary, a relationship that hardly fosters robust accountability. Intelligence oversight should be elevated and given a mandate over all DHS intelligence functions. Second, by all appearances, INA has no clear, detailed guidance about how it handles speech protected by the First Amendment. The office needs to develop robust First Amendment protections and make them public. Thank you for your interest in this important topic and for the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, thank you and the members of the committee for having us here today for this roundtable. Really appreciate the invitation. And I'm Mike Senna. I'm the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, the NICRIC, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area also there in Northern California, as also the chairman for the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council and president for the National Fusion Center Association. And with all those jobs, you know, it's hard to figure out how we keep track of everything in the country, but that's our goal and our role is to protect privacy, civil rights and civil liberties while protecting public safety. And as the president of the National Fusion Center Association, I represent the 80 fusion centers out there that are made up of 3,200 state, local, tribal, territorial partners, public safety, emergency management, fire, many other partners that are there to help identify the threats that our nation faces. Now, we refer to the 80 centers that we have as the National Network of Fusion Centers. And our role as a fusion center is to really identify, prevent, mitigate, respond, and help agencies recover from terrorist acts and major criminal threats that we face. And we depend on DHS-INA as the only federal government agency and only member of the U.S. intelligence community element that is statutorily required and charged to support our network. And a locally integrated and engaged INA is critical for every fusion center's operations, along with all of our other partners that we work with to analyze and share threat-related information that is relevant and timely. Now, a couple of things that I always want to recommend every time I get before you and any members of Congress is that we must have an increase in the forward deployment of well-trained and experienced personnel to fusion centers from INA. The other one is that we have to get the support from INA to get high-quality training for analysis, as well as privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. We also have to invest in modernizing our information sharing systems and technologies. And I've testified many times about the inadequate technologies that we currently have, and we're using yesteryear's technology and things like the Homeland Security Information Network, that HIS network, which greatly needs to be advanced from 15-year-old technology. The other one is making sure that we have access to critical data, including criminal justice information sharing systems data and classified data, and that our people can actually get clearances in a timely manner. Because it's taken, in some cases, 6 months to a year to go through this process to get people clearances so they can actually work at their desk. And then we must, have a group there at DHS-INA that's empowered to provide us with the right resources that we need. And really, we have had some good success recently with engagement from DHS with a new position in partner engagement that reports directly to the Undersecretary. Now, one of the big problems we have is that some fusion centers don't have an INA presence. And that's horrendous because that's our only way to connect to many DHS tools, resources, and phones. And that right now we do have approximately 130 personnel deployed in the field. From our perspective, that's simply not sufficient. We need the support of Congress to make sure that we have the resources for INA to get out and hire, train, retain, and deploy the appropriate number of people to personnel in fusion centers. And we also need the training for things like the Marine Postgraduate School's excellent fusion center leadership training course, which has not been in person since 2019. We've got to get the training and resources for that. The other thing is, 2/3 of the funding that fusion centers are supported by, and they're state and locally owned, is coming from state and local budgets. But a third of that is coming from grants. And one of the major problems we have with that, because it's a critical resource for all of our efforts, especially in information sharing, most of it comes from the Urban Area Security Initiative and the State Homeland Security Grant Program. But we have had issues in the past where grant funding has been denied for supporting our partners like the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, supporting major events and major mass casualty incidents where I've never been paid to reimburse for the funding to support those events, despite the fact that we believe it was grant funding eligible, but never got the authority to expend the funds that we were given for those events. The other piece of that is making sure that DHS-INA and folks at FEMA that are setting up the grant guidance are very in tune as far as what we need the resources to do, because we are waiting, months, 6 months, sometimes a year, to be able to get authorization to spend the money. And then the money's gone. Then we have a window of 6 months to actually spend money. It's insane to run operations that way. In summary, strengthening INA's capability to support the national network and the nation will require to reorient the focus. It will also require them to put the H in DHS. It's the homeland, it's the local agencies, it's the state and local partners that we need their support to help us protect our nation. So I'd recommend, all those recommendations I just mentioned are things that are critical to us and are really interfering with our operations and our ability to protect the homeland and protect our communities. We really appreciate your time. On behalf of the National Fusion Center Association, I thank you for this group of people here that we can discuss kind of the major issues and the things that I'm seeing as a person that tries to run major operations every day.
Very good. Thank you all for the opening statements. We'll now get into a discussion. We'll do about 3 minutes each. We'll switch between Republican and Democrat. That should give us about 12 to 15 minutes, and then I know we have votes coming up. And so, by the way, thank you for flexing on the time as well. This is going to be at 2 p.m., so we really appreciate the flexibility on the schedule. I'll start out, and Mr. Crane will be the filibuster timing hack here. I'll start with Mr. Cohen. You talked about the difficulty in integrating, and can you just give me maybe one example of where that integration has failed and where the organization has not been able to do it, either lack of authority or organizational reasons? I want to learn a little bit more about that.
I think generally, Mr. Chairman, as I have looked at INA's history, there's been a lot of emphasis on how it gathers and analyzes intelligence community products. And in my view, an underappreciation of the important information that can be acquired from other DHS operational components, from other parts of the federal government, like law enforcement, state and local tribal law enforcement, and even the private sector. What makes INA unique from an analytic perspective is its ability to combine information from a broad range of sources. That was the genius that Congress had at the time in creating it. So we don't need another organization that just simply looks at one silo of information. We need an organization that can reach out across multiple elements of the security framework. I can give you an example where it worked really well. During the Obama administration, Puerto Rico was suffering from a significant, unusually high number of homicides, totally driven by gang violence and transnational drug trafficking. And we were tasked at the time to bring together organizations across the federal government, state and local government, TSA, CBP, ICE, and DHS to look at all the information they had to figure out what was fueling that violence, how were the drugs getting to the island, how were guns getting to the island, and following the gangs and gang members. INA led that analytic activity. And one of the things we found, we assumed that guns were getting there through commercial aviation, because that's what sort of the thought process was. What we actually learned is that guns were being smuggled into the island via cars that were being shipped through commercial cargo. So we were preparing to engage in a major operational effort that would have been directly in the wrong place. So that's an example of where INA is looking at all sources of information, combining it, and developing analysis that helps to inform operational activities can be most valuable.
Thank you. Mr. Reynolds, appreciate your remarks and the protection of our First Amendment, expression of speech. All of the protected forms of that First Amendment are very, very critical to this. Can you give some examples here recently, and you alluded to a few of them, whether it was the targeting of reporters, things where it's the dangers of an organization have been exposed, and it has resulted in either political targeting or limitation of freedom of speech, and where that slippery slope, in your opinion, could go?
Sure, I'd be happy to. INA's approach to the First Amendment is such that they are authorized and allowed to target First Amendment protected speech where they have some sort of mission purpose to do so. And they tend to take a broad view of their counterterrorism mission such that they're interested in identifying themes and topics of the day that might potentially lead to some sort of terrorism. They've never explained how they get from the political speech to the actual terrorism, which I think is an incredibly important part of that question. But yeah, there's several examples over INA's recent history. I think the most, one of the most shocking from a few years back was during the civil rights demonstrations in 2020. They targeted the intelligence collection and dissemination on journalists who had written about INA's activities during that period. There was also an intelligence product that was sent out nationwide leading up to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, where INA, the product suggested that they were monitoring Americans just talking about abortion online, not making extreme statements or violent statements, but giving their reactions and reflections on abortion online across this political spectrum. And they sent out this intelligence, and the value of that is really questionable. And then going forward now, they've looked at COVID-19, conspiracy theories as they might call them. They've looked at environmentalists and activists across the spectrum. So it plays a central part of the work.
Thank you. Guys, that was 4.5 minutes. I'm sorry, I'm going to move on. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I have a little bit of different views, and he doesn't have time for me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we'll get into that. I mean, I think, I want to take a step back here. Again, I start from the place of, INA was created for an important purpose. That purpose still exists. But there have been some growing pains. And I think Under Secretary Weinstein, he launched a 360 review when he came in that flagged some of these same issues, right? That there need to be controls and training around First Amendment issues, that there needs to be, I think, sort of an elevation or organization around the intelligence gathering process that occurs at INA. So my first question is just a broad question from a GAO's point of view. Did that 360 review sort of correctly diagnose the issues that you found, and what kind of progress are you seeing in addressing them?
I think the results of that 360 review was accurate in terms of a renewed interest and focus on protecting U.S. person information and making sure that that privacy and that the information was collected by folks with the need to know, that it was retained appropriately. So I think that that was good. And I think some of the progress that we have seen, there's a number of monitoring efforts. There's these compliance reviews to ensure that INA personnel are handling that information appropriately. We found that there were lax controls and really no documentation that those compliance reviews were happening appropriately. The other thing that we noticed, there's these things called preliminary inquiries. And they have recently, within the past month or two, finalized a standard operating procedure to ensure that their staff understand when those auditing efforts need to happen and by whom. And so that's excellent. What we're still waiting to see is finalized procedures for when those compliance reviews, which are very important, how many are going to occur each year and when and by whom. Then there's also auditing that needs to happen of the information systems that are maintaining that information and just the data that they have on U.S. persons in general. What information do you have, and are you keeping it too long?
I think that's important, because again, I think a lot of these First Amendment type issues are issues that every law enforcement agency and every intelligence gathering organization faces, right? And the key there is it's having well-defined policies and making sure that the training is there and the auditing is there so those policies are being followed. Switching gears slightly, another issue that's bubbled up is, I think as Mr. Reynolds noted, the issue with individuals being questioned while they were in detention, and setting aside the legality of that, I'd just be curious to hear from any of you, do you still feel that there is value in INA collecting human intelligence itself versus looking at other types of open source and the products of other intelligence and law enforcement community participants? Should human intelligence collection still be part of the mission?
I'll jump on that one. I absolutely think that it should. I mean, if you're in the business of collecting information, you've got to talk to people. And there's a vast amount of folks out there, where it's not being done to the extent that we should, whether that's transnational organized crime or other criminal efforts that are underway by those that oppose us and want to cause harm to our fellow citizens. Someone needs to interview these folks, and not necessarily for any prosecution, but just collecting the information on their criminal activity to make those connections, that deeper dive of the networks. I always give the example of, and where I can definitely use Miami Health right now, is that I have over 360 identified Hondurans that are receiving drugs from the Sinaloa cartel and killing up to 700 people a year in this very small area. But those folks, for the longest period of time, were in a revolving door of the state system. Now we're getting into the federal system, but tying those folks to the network is important.
I'm getting the hook here, but I'll just say, that's very helpful, I thank you, and I'll just say, again, in response to Mr. Reynolds' point, having the right controls in place for First Amendment protections, I think, is very important. But I would also note that another failure of INA was the failure to anticipate January 6th and report on it. And so I wouldn't want to take away their ability to monitor social media at all. You just got to make sure that the right controls are in place. So I'll yield back.
Okay, Mr. Graham.
My question is from Mr. Spencer. We're talking in your opening comments about some of your concerns with the human intelligence collection program. Can you go over those and give a couple of examples of that?
Sure. So the Human Intelligence Collection Program is a long-standing INA program that has intelligence officers engaging with folks at fusion centers, state and local law enforcement, and also puts them in a position where they can interview people in jails and prisons. I think it's kind of just one instance of the typical INA program problem where some of the work that they might do is closely tied to their missions and what we think of as homeland security work when we're talking about international narcotics trafficking and things like that. There are other instances where they can get further afield from that. And I think in the terrorism context, there have been instances in INA's public record where they were talking about interviewing protesters who had been arrested on not terrorism charges, but kind of protest-related charges and things like that, which again puts them kind of into the more political role, which has risks along with it. I think one of the other challenges, which Congress has in part resolved, is that INA is going into these facilities and interviewing people without talking with their attorneys, right? These are people who are in a pretrial situation where they have rights attached to their status if they were talking to law enforcement, but INA is not law enforcement. Even though it works very closely with law enforcement, you can pass information back to the police that is obtained through a non-custodial intelligence conversation. So there's a bit of a revolving door problem there. There's also the idea that these are supposed to be kind of voluntary engagements with INA, and a jail is an inherently coercive environment. So the idea that you have somebody coming in who's a Fed and saying, on behalf of DHS, that there's like an inherent coercion in there. So I think Brandon Center still has concerns about large parts of the OA program, but we do appreciate Congress's engagement on it so far.
So is the potential overreach in statutory authority because they're not law enforcement? Is that what you're saying?
I think that's a real challenge, yeah, that they can potentially, I'm not saying intentionally, that act as kind of a workaround for what we think of as the normal rights that attach with law enforcement engagements with people.
So I think it's tricky about that issue is under statute, INA is specifically, and Congress referenced it when it talked about one of the areas of information that INA can collect and work with is law enforcement information. INA is also tasked to support the operations of the different department components, which includes law enforcement organizations. I mean, I certainly agree with Mr. Reynolds that there have been examples, problematic examples in both the interview program that you're referencing, Mr. Crane, and some of the open source collection. But as GAO and the IG found, it wasn't because there were guidelines. INA operates under Attorney General guidelines, which I've read multiple times, and I was surprised at how clear they were, how specific they were, how informative they were. I'm not sure everybody in INA's read them. Maybe that would be a good idea.
That's the problem.
But the guidelines are there. But what the problem was is that we found, and the IG found, that there was issues with inconsistent guidance from supervisors, poor training, inadequate training or awareness of collectors regarding the actual threat environment. As Mr. Reynolds said, and why should you be collecting this type of information? How does it relate to threat-related activity? Inadequate supervision. And quite frankly, something I saw during my time, because we studied this very carefully when I came in just recently, is inconsistent guidance coming from the different groups like us. We found times where you would get different opinions from the Office of General, if you were a collector, from the Office of General Counsel, from the Privacy Office, the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office, and the supervisor of that collector. And that's not fair for the collector. So they need to be well trained, they need to come under consistent supervision, and we need to make sure that they're getting accurate guidance from the folks who are there to keep them out of trouble.
Can I add on just one more additional piece? When we looked at January 6th and what happened there, they weren't fully processing tips. There needs to be a control environment. So you have the instructions, you have the training, but somebody needs to come behind and ensure that they're following all of that. So we would add on, and there needs to be a better control.
Thank you. This will be the last question from a member, and then we'll stop the on-the-record portion of this, and I will allow the staffs from both the majority and the minority side to sit with you as we go to votes. And if you want to go to votes now, you're welcome to do that. But it'll be the professional staff, not the personal offices, okay? And they can sit with you for a half hour or so, please.
Thank you, Mr. Fluger, and thank you for being here. You know, it's, I find we are having this conversation about the First Amendment, and just about every committee I sit on, and it's a little bewildering to me that we are not talking very much in the context of that highly difficult and legally complicated issue about the different ways that speech can corruptly influence the homeland. And I include election interference, and I include domestic violence, domestic terrorism. And so I think it's important that no one view this as from a purely absolute term, because it's a balancing act. And you know, I personally have a lot fewer, as someone who believes very strongly in the First Amendment, I have a lot fewer issues with anyone looking at social media or any other open source material. You put it out there in the open, that's not an invasion of your privacy, that's not that is not censoring, that is not prohibiting speech, that is becoming educated on what's out there. If it goes to another level based on, you know, what is protected purely political speech, and start using the you know, the resources of INA or the resources of the federal government to you know, to act on something that is protected speech, then we get into a different conversation. But you know, we need to focus, we need to recognize there are lots of problems in online and social media that we have to balance the First Amendment with. And I guess my question for you, Mr. Cohen, is obviously there's been a heightened focus on this area, civil rights, civil liberties. Can you talk a little bit about what this administration has done to tackle those issues over the last 3 years?
Sure, I can speak to it from an INA perspective, Congressman. But let me just say your point is exactly spot on. There's virtually no area of criminality or mission responsibility the department is confronted today in which the threat actor, foreign and domestic, foreign intelligence services, terrorist groups, transnational criminal organizations, domestic criminal organizations, where they are not using social media and other online technologies as an integral start with the methods of operation they employ to engage in criminal and oftentimes violent activity. The primary terrorism threat facing the country today comes from lone offenders who engage in violence motivated by a blend of ideological beliefs and personal grievance. Today, they develop through the consumption of online content. That online content increasingly is being placed there purposely by foreign intelligence services, terrorist organizations, domestic violence, extremist thought leaders, criminal organizations, with a specific reason to influence the behavior of those who are vulnerable to be influenced through the consumption of this content. So you have to protect the Constitution. The role of DHS and law enforcement is not the police spot, but it is to detect and mitigate threats, particularly threats of violence. Department, during my time at INA, I recognized that many of the concerns that Mr. Reynolds was bringing up were valid concerns. We started convening a legal meeting between the acting undersecretary and myself and representatives from all of the oversight offices and the analytic folks to begin talking about what were the issues that we need to get to point. How do we empower the analysts, but also make sure that the Constitution and the oversight rules are being protected. We also, I instructed the Office of General Counsel to develop a robust memorandum. It's almost 20 pages long that went specifically looked at the issues that you're raising, Mr. Goldman. We started expanding the training for the collectors so that they better understood what was permissible and what was not. And I think what you will hear shortly from Undersecretary Weinstein are some additional steps that will address some of the concerns that we developed structurally, training-wise, oversight-wise, that was impacting the ability of the department to carry out its mission.
Thank you. How many members not voting yet?
We're at 357.
350, okay. 1 minute each. Closing statement. We'll go back in reverse order, so we'll start with you, Mr. Sina.
You know, from my perspective, and especially the things that we need from DHS-INA, it's, I've been doing this for 22 years in the Fusion Center world, and I still do not have all the resources I need, and the focus and capabilities. We talked about those real-time open source threats that we have, that information at the top. But January 6th, the Fusion Center Network was seeing that and trying to report that, ring bells, but our partners at DHS-INA didn't have the same access capabilities to look at that information, and that's the problem. We got to figure out how to focus them on the threats, the real world issues we've got, and get them to the point where we can get that true analysis in a timely manner quickly. Without that, we're going to continue to have repeats of January 6th, and I hope that we never have a repeat of 9/11, but every day I felt like I'm getting closer to September 10th, 2001, without those resources.
Thank you. Mr. Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I agree with the statements that, you know, it was a commendable exercise to create something like INA to fuse together information to get people talking to each other. I think the challenge with INA is that it has a very strong mandate, that its officers often find confusing, and it allows for political tampering, as we've seen in the past, politicizing the agency, which is the last thing that an element of the U.S. Intelligence Community should ever happen to it. And it's an agency that proceeds without a lot of safeguards for the sorts of public engagement and discourse that we hold dear as Americans. And I think, you know, if INA is to continue to engage in its intelligence operations around social media collection, human collection, at a minimum it needs to develop practices and processes and follow them and audit them and explain them to the American public for how it engages in those activities. I think there's also a lot of opportunities for Congress here with INA. There really just is not good transparency and oversight for the agency. I think elevating, strengthening the oversight office so that it has independence from the office that it's overseeing and a broader mandate within DHS is a really clear opportunity and next step for Congress.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to accept the outset, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this conversation. It's important. I mentioned earlier the volatility of the current threat environment. We are experiencing mass casualty attacks by foreign terrorist operatives, as well as, or concerned with mass casualty attacks by foreign terrorist operatives, as well as lone offenders who are motivated by a blend of ideological beliefs and personal grievances. We're seeing an increased utilization by state and non-state foreign actors of cyber attacks, information operations, and kinetic activities being used in a cohesive, coordinated way. We're seeing increased use of the internet-based tools by transnational criminal groups, fentanyl traffickers, those involved in human smuggling and human trafficking. We're seeing an increase in threats to government officials, Republicans and Democrats, who are being targeted online with doxing, swatting, and threats of violence to them and their families. We're seeing threats to the physical aspects and the people who run our elections, where, again, we see law enforcement is concerned about the election being disrupted through the use of swatting, doxing, and other types of cyber techniques. My biggest concern is that we are not organizing quickly enough at a national level to deal with these threats. And I take Mr. Reynolds' points in many regards. We need to have some hard conversations whether the original design of INA is consistent to meet the needs of today, in today's threat. And yes, we need to carry out those responsibilities in a way that protects the Constitution and civil liberties of Americans, but we need to do it because the threat is far too high for us now.
Thank you.
I'll be quick, and thank you again for inviting GAO. The first point, given the current threat environment, DHS must develop a strategy for how it's sharing information with these internet companies, social media, gaming, all of those. I think they're working and they're sharing information, but it's not organized, and we need to understand what's the goals. The second point I'd like to make, what are your customer needs? They have, after every threat product, they ask for some feedback. They need to be more proactive and ask, what do you need from us, and tailor those threat products based on what the customer is saying that they need. They need to be more timely, they need to be more targeted. And the third point, collect performance information, track to your strategic goals, so you can illustrate what you're accomplishing.
Very good. Thank you all for taking time. This will end the official portion of the roundtable. As I mentioned, we have to vote, but I think it's important if Art and I'm gonna let you lead this, Michael, to continue to ask some of those detailed questions that we just heard and maybe get into the weeds for 20 or 30 minutes so that we can continue to gather information. But I think it's very helpful. We want to do oversight. We want to get to the point where it is performing its functions in the way that's consistent, with the formation of this group. But